Hello, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to the First Division Museum, right here on the beautiful grounds of Cantini Park. We are able to do all this because of the kind generosity of Colonel Robert R. McCormick, whose historic estate this used to be, and who served with the First Division in World War I and is our benefactor. So tonight we're going to bring you James Carl Nelson. He's an author. He has a bachelor's degree in journalism from the University of Minnesota and has worked as a staff writer for the Miami Herald. He is the author of The Remains of Company D, a story of the Great War, which follows the members of Company D, 28th Infantry Regiment of the United States 1st Infantry Division, from enlistment to combat during World War I. Tonight he will be talking about his new book, 5 Lieutenants, which follows the story of these 5 lieutenants during their service in World War I. And without further ado, let's bring up Jim Nelson.
Thank you, JD. My second trip here, and I'm glad to see so many people out here. I did one of these events in my hometown of Minneapolis in December, and 3 people showed up, so I think 2 of those were lost. So it's kind of nice to see the place, pretty much filled up. I wrote a second book, 5 Lieutenants, the heartbreaking story of 5 Harvard men who led America to victory in World War I, the longest subtitle in publishing history. Also functions as the first chapter. But the book is not really per se about Harvard, although it's in the title. There's a common denominator that holds the story together. These 5 men attended Harvard. It's really more a story of an individual story, a deep individual story as a group. These people were all connected together. But as an aside, what is interesting about Harvard in World War I is it was very active, not only in sending men into the war, but before that, in the preparedness movement that sprang up in the mid-teens, like 1915, led by Harvard graduate and former President Teddy Roosevelt, that they felt it was inevitable that the United States would get into the war that was then going on in Europe at some point, and that we should be training and training officers for that eventuality. There was a real strong factor of people who felt that that was going to happen. There was a rival factor that felt simply by having this preparedness movement would lead the United States most definitely into war. That it was just going to be a definite event then. But what is interesting is Harvard sent 11,000 graduates or former graduates, undergraduates who left school into the war in various military occupations, military, medicinal, all this. 325 of them died, and both those numbers are the largest of any school, post-secondary school in the United States. It shows quite a commitment, which we probably wouldn't see today on the part of Harvard. But there was a feeling that it is and was the pinnacle educational institution in the United States, and as such was a leader in many ways of society. I think some of that has been lost too. Whether that was right or wrong, they were committed. They, as a student body and former student body, committed vast resources into the war, which is, like I say, unusual. Also, as a result of the preparedness movement, there was a Plattsburgh camp of 1915 and a couple other smaller camps. They called it the tired businessman camps, where there was sort of an older clientele attended. Learned, dug ditches, did exercises, were all in anticipation of, if war came, that they'd be commissioned officers. There was a second camp in 1916, which was a little more sprightly, and saw younger men joining up. And all 5 of the men in this book were part of that 1916 camp as well, except for Richard Newhall was a professor at the time. 4 of them were in the Harvard Regiment, which sprang up in the winter and spring of 1916. There's about 1,000 undergraduates at Harvard who drilled, who dug ditches at Fresh Ponds, an area of Harvard. You could see them marching around Harvard Yard. They had thin cast-off yellow uniforms from the Spanish-American War. So, it's not something you would have seen on the campus in 1965 or 69. No, you know what I mean? And you wouldn't see it today. But it was accepted. They actually had a liaison from the Army who led this regiment, and he just, the Harvard president and this Army major, I believe, was, their opinion was that Harvard men are the best, and of course, naturally, they will be leading our troops in battle. This is the conceit of the times was, it's hard to say if it's wrong or right, but the conceit was that, these are the cream of the crop because they attend Harvard, and therefore they're going to be leading men into war. The book itself sprang from my first book, Remains of Company D. I'll talk a little bit about that. It's a really good book. Thank you. That book is an account of my grandfather's unit, Company D of the 28th Infantry Regiment, United States 1st Division. My grandfather was a Swedish immigrant, came over in the Lusitania in 1911, 4 years before it was sunk, and wound up in Chicago working as a painter. He was drafted and wound up at Camp Grant in 1917, and then wound up being sent overseas as a replacement in the spring of 1918. And he showed up for duty with Company D just outside of the trenches at Cantigny on June 16th, 1918. They had been through the Battle of Cantini 2 weeks before, had come out of the trenches, another stint in the trenches after that. In the battle, they lost about 100 men. They lost about 25 men killed and about 75 wounded, most of them put out of the war for good. A month later, my grandfather was sent with his refurbished company back up to strength or approaching strength to the area of Soissons, below the city of Soissons, where they joined the Moroccan 1st Division and the 2nd Division, including 2 regiments of Marines, in a counterattack below the city that pretty much is noted as the turning of the tide. They routed the Germans from what was this area. There was a big sag in their lines, cut off the neck pretty much. The Germans had to retreat from there. My grandfather was shot in the assault on Plassey, the village of Plassey, on July 19th. He laid out on the ground overnight and was picked up and carried, he said, by Algerians, whatever, French colonials, to medical treatment the next day. And lived to be 101. But he died in 1993. Always heard this story growing up. There was never anything more to it. Always fascinated me. But old soldiers, if they want to talk about it, you let them talk about it. You don't pry. It's kind of the feeling was. He also was not much of a talker anyway. When he died, I felt the liberty to start looking into some of these stories, including the big story that had captivated my imagination, which was, somebody I knew had been shot, in France and almost died. I thought he was with the Swedish Army at the time. I had no idea. It's a little bit of an oxymoron, I know. But, so I started, looking into it. I wrote away here to Andrew Woods and Eric Gillespie, who worked downstairs at the McCormick Research Center. And about a month later, they sent me these partial muster rolls from Company D of the 20th Infantry, and he was on there. And he was listed on August 1st, 1918 as being listed as missing since recent operations, which I thought was such a odd term. It's clinical, but at the same time expressive somehow, I almost made that the title of whatever book I was going to do. But I looked at these other names, Zygmunt Mischewitz, Ignatius Olenchak, Roland Liebig, the company commander's name was Soren C. Sorensen. And I said, who are these guys? And so I started looking into seeing who these guys were, and with the idea of doing a book about it, because I just thought it was fascinating. That he certainly had never talked about anybody. He talks a little about the war anyway. And so bit by bit, I started gathering information for my supposed book, which is now a wonderful book. It took about 6 years, and I had to come up with certain strategies to do it, because number one, there are things fighting against you if you want to try to write about World War I. I don't know, I haven't done any other wars, but I conceive of the Civil War as being much more literary. Men kept diaries, and there were all sorts of letters and newspapers, and everybody was writing about this war, at least on the northern side, I guess. When you come to World War I, there was censorship. It was heavy censorship, to the degree where most of the typical doughboy letter reads something like, "How are you? I am fine. Is my old hog fat yet? If you send me a picture, I'll send you a picture of me. Well, I have to go now." It's kind of like that. It's almost like that, bare bones. Or if they went into action, like say they'd been through the Battle of Cantini, they write home and say, "Well, we went over the top and sure was some big deal. How you doing?" And that was it. That was about all they could write. They couldn't any details about it. So If you're trying to like gather about what was it like, what were they doing, what's going on there really, it was tough to do. And they also banned diaries as of the first of the year of 1918. But I did find a few loopholes. What I did get from Company D's men was a good day-to-day, they were allowed to say what they were kind of doing. If there was a ball, they had a ball game against the machine gun company, or they're marching, this or that, not where they're going, but they're marching, these kind of things. A good day-to-day thing that way. The loopholes were, though, wonderful. If one was wounded and wound up in the hospital, it seemed pretty evident that there was nobody there to censor his letters. I had some great letters written from the hospital while the war was still going on, including some accounts of Soissons. And the other great loophole was the platoon commanders, the junior officers, were supposed to censor their men's letters, which they did, but they didn't censor their own in a lot of cases. So they would, they're just like, well, I'm just going to tell it like it is. They'd send it home. And I found over time that was something that was maybe worth investigating, just to add context. So I was looking for, oral narratives for the 28th Infantry. And I did find an interesting document. I found a reprimand that had been handed down to a lieutenant. And in the bound World War I volumes, you'll find in the library or here, the name was redacted. But I had a researcher at the National Archives go in and get that. And we had the name. His name was Harry Martin. And he had been reprimanded because a letter that he had written home to Emporia, Kansas about the Battle of Cantini had wound up in the local newspapers. Parents had taken it down there. And it was a long, vivid account. It was great for my purposes, But a couple months later, wound back to France, and he was reprimanded, and it said, Lieutenant Harry Martin shall not censor his own letters anymore. So, but that was a good clue as to, where maybe to go, because it was kind of like, I wanted to get through the layers. I wanted to get to the truth about this war. I think, there's been a lot written on the Allied side, the French side, German side even, the British side. A whole outpouring of literature has come from the war in their cases. And it went longer for them, given. And a lot more casualties, a lot more suffering. But I just feel like there's been a dishonesty about World War I in a way, the way we've handled it. Number one, because of the censorship and the literary traditions surrounding it. Also the fact that once the war was over and the boys started coming home, it was like American society just hit a switch and didn't want to hear anything anymore. There really isn't. There are some good works, but most of the stuff that came out right after the war was like what the boys did over there and these kind of echoes from over there. It's real kind of like gung-ho, not really telling you the truth about what's going on there. So, long story short, I went looking for these lieutenants to see. So I was casting about everywhere, and I found this book. It was called Newhall and Williams College, Selected Papers of a History Professor at a small New English college from 1917 to 1973, which doesn't, sounds like an obvious source to find something, doesn't it? But it turns out he had been a lieutenant in Company L of the 28th. My grandfather was in Company D, and a Harvard man, Harvard PhD in history. And I got the book, and it was amazing. I mean, it was not his complete letters, his selected, but from his war years, very detailed, very open, astonishingly open, kvetching about his company commander, complaining about this guy, complaining about the pettiness of the Army, the military, how he's in the military, but he's never gonna be of it. So he's kind of like, instantly reminded me of the Groucho Marx joke about the guy who never belonged to any club that would have him as a member. Just kind of like, irascible. And I thought it held great promise. Also within that book, a short section, he was writing about another lieutenant in his company with whom he obviously had become great friends, a guy named George Guest Haydock. I'll tell you a little bit more about Newhall. He was from Minneapolis. He was the son of a fairly well-to-do small businessman, sort of insurance salesman. He was not robust. He was not into sports. He was studious, a real bookworm. He liked to go to the opera with his mother. I mean, he's kind of like, never had any friends, a real loner. So he was a real character. But he was also fascinated by the military, probably because he was taken with history, and he was taken especially with the Crusades. And so even when he was at the University of Minnesota doing his undergrad, he, during the summers, was doing what would now amount to like ROTC training at Fort Snelling in St. Paul, right across the river. And so when time came, he saw war coming. There's letters from him from early as, February of 1917, saying he's pretty much made up his mind that he's going to have to enlist. He knows war is coming. But he wanted to, of course, be an officer. I guess it was just, if you go to Harvard, that's what you want to do. You felt it was I don't know if you felt it was your duty, your birthright, both, whatever it is. So he applied to Plattsburgh officer training camp there. There was like 16 officer training camps. Got in. He actually had already won a commission there, earned a commission there the summer before during the preparedness camp. But still, again, early on, his yin and yang of being in the military and despising the military sort of raised its ugly head for Newhall. And simply because the book is written so much in their words, I just thought I'd do a few sections of just here and there, give you a flavor for their type of writing and how they're talking. And this is Newhall's about 5 weeks into Plattsburgh training, and it says, by then he saw very clearly that his inability to simply do instead of questioning why was putting him on perhaps unsteady ground. Quote, I am becoming more and more conscious of my limitations as a military man and won't be at all surprised if I am not utilized after this camp is over, he wrote. I may be able to acquire more of the military spirit. I am no worse than large numbers of the men here, which, however, is small comfort. We are all very civilian. The chief difference, I guess, is that most men are willing and eager to cultivate the military state of mind, and I am not, or at least only half-heartedly. I accept with resignation, often without conscious consideration, the complete disorganization of my future. Perhaps the military work helps that. It certainly makes you learn to accept what is assigned to you as inevitable and act accordingly. I am trying not to philosophize. It is unmilitary, fills me with doubts, and generally impairs military efficiency. This is no life for thinking. So this was his attitude about it. He's just always fighting. He doesn't like being judged by standards which he doesn't believe he should be judged by, which are solely military standards, or that he should have to necessarily kowtow to someone else simply because of the rank is higher, which is always a bit difficult, I think, for people who go into the service. Anyway, so he became, in France, great friends with George Haydock, who was a Quaker, son of he'd grown up in Germantown, Pennsylvania, which is a real Quaker hotspot, gone to Harvard. In the meantime, his parents had moved to outside of Boston in Massachusetts. George was very insecure, very shy, very reticent, reserved, very likable, great athlete. He made his name as a pole vaulter at Harvard. He had gone to the preparedness camp in 1916. Never got anything from George on why he enlisted when war was declared, other than his father saying that he felt that by doing his part in this war, maybe there would be no more wars, i.e. the end all wars was, of course, the big idea back then. So he went through Plattsburgh, roughly 90 days training, and towards the end of, or mid-August of 1917, you didn't necessarily get your commission. There were a lot of people vying for them, and they posted names like on a bulletin board, and you'd go and, it's like to see if you made the varsity lacrosse squad. You go and look at the board. And so George went and found to his astonishment that he'd been made a first lieutenant. Most of them were getting commissions as second lieutenants. And this is just a little vignette describing a little bit who George was. He's 22 years old, just almost 23, where there's a notice goes out that they're looking for volunteers to go to overseas immediately, which it's not says France, but obviously where else are they going to go at that point, right? So several days later, the captain called together those who had been commissioned and asked for volunteers for field service abroad in France. 8 second and first lieutenants were needed, but George balked. Quote, my first thought was nothing doing the USA is good enough for me, he would write. Then I thought there would be no chance of my getting it, as he only wanted 2 firsts. So here's where I might as well get credit for being a sport, even if I am not one, and up went my hand. While he was writing the names down, I thought of mother, and down came my hand again. Then it occurred to me that it might mean the men were to go to school over there, and it would be a good chance. The captain, however, had implied that we'd be put into the line, but I figured that we would get more training first, and the gambling instinct rose. So up went my hand again, just in time to be the last one on the list. That night, he tossed and turned again. I stayed awake thinking about a mile a minute until after 3, but a big change came over me during that night. I made up my mind to take whatever came my way as though I had expected it, and then to get away with it if I possibly could. The next morning, Haydock was called to see Captain Lang, who looked him in the eye for a long moment with a, quote, funny little smile. Haydock nervously stared back until Lang finally pushed some papers toward him and said, Well, Mr. Haydock, here's your death warrants. Which I love. I just love the image of George, just like, what have I gotten myself into? There's a lot more writing from him as he's taking the train down to Hoboken to get on a boat and go to France. He's like, oh my God, what have I done? That George was friends with a local boy, a boy who grew up in Highland Park. His name was William Otho Potwin Morgan. His grandparents had begun the Chicago Varnish Company, post-Chicago fire, industrial concern, very wealthy. His father had died young, and in response, his mother dressed him in girl's clothes and let his hair grow long until he was 6 years old. I'm not a Freudian, I don't know what to say about that, but it seems a little odd. He went to boarding schools out east, and then to Harvard, and he grew out into a rugged boy, great athlete, good hockey player for the time, not a whole lot of hockey players. He actually knew Hobie Baker, because Hobie Baker turns up in one of Morgan's letters, if anybody knows who Hobie Baker is. The Hobie Baker Award is named for Hobie Baker, and the person who gets it is the best hockey player in America, college player. So Hobie Baker was a big deal in a time when hockey was not that big a deal. Anyway, Morgan went to Harvard. He was not done. He was ending his junior year when war was declared, but by then he had found a girlfriend, although he had not had a girlfriend before that, a tomboy. Her name was Christina Councilman, and she was the daughter of a medical professor at Harvard. And then the spirit of the time, just the romantic heartstrings were flowing, and they saw it so romantic too that she was sending this boy off to war, her betrothed, and that he was going to war for her. And so they went, and he went to officers training at Fort Sheridan. And once that was completed, he got his commission, and he got his assignment to head straight overseas in about September of 1917. And he stopped back in Boston on the way, and he met with his girlfriend's parents, and they said, we want to get engaged, before Bill goes off to war. And they grudgingly said, okay, he's probably not going to live anyway. So, and seriously, but it was kind of like that. But in giving the toast, her father lifted his glass and said, to the babes in the woods. I mean, they were just so young. He was he was 21, 22, but he's very young, 21, 22. Had lived a very sheltered life. But he got to France and was put into a training camp. A lot of the junior officers, after completing their training here, were sent over and got further training by usually British or Scottish officers, from what I've seen, at least those destined for the 1st Division, in small training camps in Teutoncourt, places like this. He wound up in a training camp with George Haydock. I believe they had known each other at Harvard, probably through a sports connection. It was never spelled out, but they certainly knew each other fairly well, and then wound up in France together initially. And I just want to write, he wrote a little bit, he's been listening to these war stories of the Brits and Scots who are tutoring them in the martial arts over there. I wonder and how great it is, and it inspires him initially and gets his imagination rolling. I just want to read a little bit from that. Morgan was slowly learning to think, at least temporarily, like a soldier and to live only in the present. Quote, I am gradually losing my old perspective of life, he wrote. The future seems a mirage far away, and it does not drag me back as it did in America, where there's no direct contact with the war. Over here, there are few flags and no cheering. It is a deep, fierce war spirit, which is, after all, the real stuff. It will sicken me to come back to America unless there has been a long casualty list before I return. The war Morgan came to see transcended matters of nationalism or patriotism or even religion and became an entity in itself. It comprised life, just man against man. Quote, this war is sacred to them, he would write of the Scots and Englishmen at the camp. The solemn battlefield dotted with its crosses, a land where villages once stood, now absolutely barren and pitted with shell holes. What was once forests, now only charred stumps. All this is holy ground to these men, ground where the best friends have fallen. The rapture of battles not yet fought and realities not yet experienced seized Morgan that autumn. I hope it won't be long before I can ram my bayonet through the throat of one of those brutes who have turned France into such a living hell of grief, he wrote. How I long to lead Americans against these cursed Boches and feel that I can hold up my head among the English and the French. Getting killed seems a small matter over here, for we are engulfed in this splendid spirit, and we lose sight of what it will mean to you at home. It seems so unlike me, and I wonder if I am dreaming when I long to kill a man. But as they say over here, There's only one good German, a dead one. You know, he's talking pretty tough for a guy who hasn't been in battle or anything like that. Another one who wound up in a training camp with Richard Newhall was George Buchanan Redwood. He was 30 years old that fall. He's a Harvard 1910 graduate, and he had known Newhall's older brother, and so there was a connection right away between Newhall and Buchanan Redwood. Redwood was a very interesting guy. He was quite wealthy. His father had been quite a prominent Baltimore businessman, but he had been killed in a train wreck, I believe in 1905. He was going to a private hunting retreat with the owner of a railroad, and they were on the side of they were stopped in the tracks, and another train came along and blasted through him. But he was left with quite a bit of money, but he became a newspaper man of all things. He didn't follow his father into trade. Nobody could see him doing that. He had sort of an artist's soul, but at the same time, he's a lot of push and pull in him between religion and a love for the military. He's always trying to decide between the two. Kind of winds up with this newspaper trade. He's a real estate writer for the Baltimore News for some years. Then some sort of health problem struck him, and he moved to Asheville, North Carolina for a while and kind of recuperated some sort of stomach ailment. Went back to Baltimore. He attended the 1915 and 1916 Plattsburgh camps, where he indulged his love of the military there. And then when war was declared, he applied for officers training and went to Fort Myer in Virginia and did his training there. Was commissioned, sent to France, and like I say, wound up in the same camp as Newhall, who went across in September of 1917. And as we'll see, Redwood would be landed in the 28th Regiment also, at Company I, become fast friends with Newhall, Haydock. All the pictures I have of them, the three of them are together. It's interesting. You know, Redwood was one of those who adhered to a little less of he didn't open up in his letters. He adhered to the censorship principles pretty well. But he's very funny, very humorous. He's very religious, but not like in a Harry Hairshirt sense at all. He's always laughing about stuff, pulling pranks on people. And he became just a wonder as a battalion scout, going out, especially in the lines at Seicheprey and Cantigny, and bringing back information. And one infamous incident at Seicheprey with a small group of his men, he brought back 4 prisoners, one of whom asked, when he was given hot coffee and food, whether he couldn't go back and get his brother, bring him back over too. It was a very famous incident. He was written up in the newspapers for that. That was in March of 1918. I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, I'm sorry. That's the 4th of my 5 lieutenants. The 5th lieutenant, number 5, is George Alexander McKinlock Jr. from Lake Forest, Illinois. His father was the owner of the city electric system, which supplied electrical supplies, residential, whatever, post-Chicago fire. He made a fortune. His father had moved from Detroit and started it. And his mother was Marion McKinlock, and she decided that she had to have a place in Lake Forest, because that's what, at that time, turn of the century, you were nobody if you didn't have a place, a mansion in Lake Forest. So they built this place at Deer Path and Waukegan Roads called Brown Gables. And Alexander Jr., call him Junior, I guess, showed up in 1893, and he grew up there. He didn't go to school, no formal schooling until he was 10 years old. He just kind of rode horses and played with the Armors and the Swifts and, all the other McCormick children. It was the real Gilded Age kind of lifestyle for them. And Marion McKinlock was the doyen of not only Chicago society, but Lake Forest society, and later Palm Beach society, when they had started to spend most of their time down there. So Alexander went to boarding school when he finally did go to school, and then from 10 on, he was basically in school in Massachusetts, 2 different boarding schools, then Harvard. He developed into quite an athlete. He played with Eddie Mahan at Harvard for football. I don't know if that name means anything to you. He was like the original triple threat: pass, kick, run, whatever the hell it was, punt. I don't know. And so he was kind of a star at Harvard, very lackadaisical student. There's one letter where it looks like he's been put on probation, and there's a new car from Daddy-O hanging in the balance, if he gets through and graduates. It's just, so, I mean, I have to say, he is, of the five, he's the most unformed from what I could gather. I mean, not that he's stereotypical, it's just that he's had an easy life. But, you know, war breaks out, and his first impulse is to apply for officers training, which he goes through with Bill Morgan at Fort Sheridan. Like I mentioned, that I think they knew each other from being in the northern suburbs and maybe social events up there. They knew of each other, definitely. And they would run into each other in France, and actually, I have letters from Morgan describing how they spent these kind of holiday Sunday afternoons lounging around drinking, you know, at mckinlock's digs. He went to officers training, went across like the rest of them in the fall of 17. He never really landed with an individual company like the other three, like Newhall, Redwood, and Haydock did. Morgan wound up with the 3rd Machine Gun Battalion, which is, he took a platoon. I don't know why. McKinlock just kind of became an eternal student for some months there during the winter of 1917, 1918. His letters home are just filled with small matters of, you know, getting his laundry done, these kind of things, running into people. But it's funny, his fame followed him as a football player, followed him to France, because there's one incident where he's walking into a staff building, and someone stops and says, "Hey, aren't you so-and-so?" Yeah, I'm, you know, football hero. He says, "Yeah." He says, "Hey, you know, there might be a job for you on 2nd Brigade, you know, blah, blah, blah." So he's known within the 1st Division. He really didn't get a job until later in about February. He landed on the 3rd Machine Gun Battalion staff, where Bill Morgan was a platoon commander. So, 1st Division. 1st Division was the 1st Division. You know, it cobbled together from the 16th, 18th, 26th, 28th Regiment, went over in June, about half strength, under strength anyway, and went immediately to training in the Gondricourt area, sort of northeastern France. Was slowly brought up to strength with some draftees, some recruits, and people like these 5 lieutenants who were, you know, getting their commissions after 3 months, and going over and taking up companies or platoons. The 1st Brigade of the division, the 16th and 18th regiments, went into the trenches in January in the area around Seicheprey, north of Gondricourt, stayed there, rotating in by battalion until about early March, and then the 2nd Brigade went in, the 26th and 28th regiments. And it was an active area. There had been one rotation in October, actually a very famous incident where the 1st soldiers in the 1st Division were killed. I think actually the first in the war killed in action in the Somerville section. But this was really the first real test for the men. They get it, you know, there's a lot of gas, there's a lot of shelling. The Germans are pulling for some fairly large-scale raids. So it's definitely, you know, the war is being ramped up for these guys over there now. And I just thought I'd mention a little bit of a vignette from that time when Company L was in the trenches, and Richard Newhall was describing a little bit what that was like for him. Richard Newhall found his life at the front to be one of, quote, absolute quiet alternating with pandemonium, with little intervals of minor excitement. I got plenty of time to ponder things during the long nights when it was necessary to be on the alert, but when nothing happened. Seemingly unperturbed by the reality of a situation, he instead reveled in his deadly and grotesque surroundings. Really, it was the most picturesque sitting out under a clear sky, watching and listening, he would write. The outline of the gas sentry's head and shoulders was the only thing to keep me company. At intervals, off to the left and right, the Germans would shoot up flares which would light up the landscape and make big shadows for a moment. Occasionally, a machine gun would rip off a short burst of fire. By and by, overhead came the angry burr of a squadrilla flying over into Boschland. Not long after came the sound of distant bomb dropping. Hear that, Sonny? I says to the sentry. They're dropping bombs on the German dumps. I hope to Christ one of them hits the Kaiser right on the noodle. Came back an answer from the most boyish member of the platoon who happened to be on post. I guess we should all say amen to such a prayer. A rat splashing along the trench arouses my suspicion that someone is approaching, and my hand goes to my pistol, but it doesn't take long to be able to detect radish sounds, and I ignore them. Over on the right, one of our big batteries starts bracketing. i.e. firing a long and a short shot at the same point, trying to find a German machine gun. In return, the Hun machine gun would come back with a laughing burst of fire, as much to say, "Never touched me," and by our guns gave it up. Not so my platoon, for whenever the German shot off his rat-a-tat, I would hear an answering pump, pump, pump from my right automatic rifle and would know that Corporal Stetz was right on the job. Newhall's interesting because for all of his, I don't know, he wants to be in the military, he doesn't want to be in the military, he believes in the cause, he believes that in the cause that we're fighting for, but at the same time, he was a very able platoon commander. His men loved him, especially he had, as many of these platoon commanders did in the time, 30% of the AEF, some figure like that, were immigrants. So he had a number of Polish and Russians in his platoon who he came to know very well. And it's funny, so it's a funny anecdote is he's trying to teach people, what to do, how to take prisoners and these kind of things. And he says, one of his Polish corporals said, "No, it's just be much better just to kill them all." Sort of shows, where Polish and Germans not always get along through history. So there's, and Newhall appreciated that. Newhall and Haydock, what became the center point of the book and the center point of my interest in the book was their relationship, which began in about January of 1918 when they had been ships sailing in the night. They were different schools, they'd come back, somebody else was sick. George happened to be sick for a spell, and Haydock, or Newhall, took to stopping by to see how he was doing in these kind of things. They started playing chess together, and they just found that they had real common ideas about the Army, about men, about the war, about just about everything. And George was 6 years younger than him, but they became great friends. And Newhall would drag him all over on off hours to cathedrals and different historic sites around France that they could get to, or to old Roman sites where they'd go digging for coins and these kind of things. And they really regarded each other as, I guess, islands in the sea of insanity. George came to regard being in the Army as, he would liken it to Alice in Wonderland. And you can see his mindset firming up and changing under the influence of Newhall, who was already who he is. He's 6 years older, and the Newhall is really exerting an influence that becomes apparent as George becomes a little more cynical about things. He takes it very seriously, but he does not really believe in really the pettiness of the Army, as Newhall would always rave about that. So they were at Seychelles, and then there's a series of German offensives started while they were in the lines. There were 5 of them, and the situation on the Western Front became very dire. Pershing had tried to keep his troops from being grabbed by the Allies and use piecemeal against the Germans, division here, division there. And he held out. Things became so dire, the German threat, that he had to go to Ferdinand Foch, the overall marshal, and say, all that we have is yours. And so the 1st Division was pulled out of lines in front of Seychelles, moved back north of Paris, underwent some open warfare training. It's a whole other area. Pershing believed in open warfare. His whole goal was to move American troops out of the trenches, get them moving into Germany, end of story, war over. Not as easy as it seemed. But the 1st Division in late April was moved to Picardy, 50 miles north of Paris, to a small village called Cantigny, which of course should have a familiar ring to it. I know it's where Robert McCormick served with the field artillery. 1st Brigade went into the trenches there, and in the meantime, the division decided that it was going to take this village, small hilltop village. The Germans had command of artillery over them slightly on the heights, but more importantly, they wanted to make a statement. Pershing wanted to make a statement. The Americans wanted to make a statement, and believe me, the soldiers, by and large, from what you read about what they were saying, they were ready to make a statement. They were ready to, let's get out of these trenches and go to Germany, basically. I mean, the morale was high, so they laid out a plan that the 28th Infantry would take the village of Cantigny on May 28th, 1918, and it was what everybody described it as a set-piece attack. They pulled the troops out of line a couple days before, practiced and practiced over ground similar to that they'd be facing at Cantini. It was so boring that Newhall wrote that at one point he was just standing there with all the music from Aida going through his head. This is the kind of guy Newhall was. What kind of doughboy talks like that, right? So that's why you gotta love him. Company L was to be on the far left of the line with the 3rd Battalion. Basically, the plan was for the 28th Infantry, about 1,000 men, to assault in a line, company to company. 9 companies with 3 in reserve. Take the town, move about 500 yards east of the town, and start digging in under fire. I mean, it was just like, basically build a new perimeter line, build a new further extension of the line. And so everybody, was up for it. Everybody was ready for it. Preparations had been made. It had all been planned out to the nth degree. And this is just the preview, the eve of battle, as described by Richard Newhall. At 6:30 a.m., Newhall again made his way through the crowded jump-off trenches, found Haydock, and talked to his friend for a few minutes about trivial things. Neither of us seemed to have any feeling of parting, any realization of imminent danger. To Newhall, it seemed so impossible that we were now going into battle instead of a mere maneuver that we only discussed the details of what we planned to do and picked out the landmarks by which we could direct our movements. He then returned to the 2nd Platoon and confidently awaited the order to advance. I would also suppose that the last few hours before going into battle were full of tense excitement, he would write. They're not. We had practiced it until each man knew just what he was going to do. Our artillery was pounding the German lines in such a way as to make it probable that we would merely walk over and occupy them. Soon enough, word came down the line. In 5 minutes, we go over, get a foothold on the trench wall so as to be able to get over quickly. Each lieutenant, Newhall wrote, gets out his whistle and figures out how he's going to jump to make sure he's the first man of the platoon to get onto the parapet. His eyes clutch his wristwatch. The moving barrage has started. Whistles pipe shrilly along the line. A succession of single figures 75 yards apart line the parapet for an instant. The platoon chiefs, come on, platoon. Into the bright rising sun stepped Richard Newhall, leading the 2nd Platoon, just a small figure, just one of some 3,500 men plodding east toward an imaginary line beyond the first German trenches. The Harvard PhD finally finding his chance to make some history, finally taking part in a grand crusade of his own, finally and eagerly about to discover what a battle was like. As he stepped forward amid the smoke, amid the din, amid the chunks of earth peppering the sky from the rolling barrage, Newhall chanced to look to his right, where George Haydock and his men trod slowly east. I caught a glimpse of George walking at the head of his platoon, he would write, and that is the last I saw of him. Newhall didn't last long. He lasted maybe 200 yards. He got shot, quick succession, by a sniper 3 times, laid him on the ground. They even shot him while he was on the ground. So that was basically it. That's as far as he got. And he spent the next 40 hours in that position, in agony, unable to move while the battle, his men continued on and the battle raged. Excuse me. But that end of the line didn't get that far anyway. Newhall had discovered the night before, while he was marking out where his platoon was supposed to be, that there was a gap on that far end of the line. These French troops had pulled out, and it was being covered by German machine guns. So that left end of the line, Company L and Company K, got only so far, hit the ground, went to ground, and then later in the day, just almost pretty much stampeded back to the original line. Whereas the middle battalion and the southern battalion, the 1st and 2nd battalions, were able to move through, clear the village, move out onto the field. But they also, a lot of companies suffered about 30% casualties in the first half hour because of the severe fire. George Haydock, meanwhile, moved with his 1st platoon, was held up for a while, and there's machine gun fire coming from a pile of beets on the left. And he was in a small piece of trench that his men had taken, directing fire on this machine gun at the pile of beets when he was hit and instantly killed. Newhall had no way of knowing about this. He didn't find out until later. I'll get to that. George Redwood, battalion scout, had been actually very active even before they jumped off. He was already been wounded by the time the jump off occurred. He was flitting about, doing his thing, drawing maps, sketching German positions, just having a ball. This is what he loved to do, and he was great at it. What's kind of strange, though, is his friend, Samuel Irvin, who would become a United States Senator. Had been his roommate, actually, for a while, his billet mate. And others reported that George had gone to an aid station and said that he fully intended to die with his company that morning. And you don't know why. I mean, it's hard to say if it was a martyr that set an example, that this was the fulfillment of what he wanted to do over there. It's hard to say because it's very valued by the 1st Division and the AEF in general. He had stopped during the later in the day when the Company K was retreating and the 3rd Battalion was retreating. He stopped to help a wounded officer, and he dragged him back to safety. And then he was going back forward to try to stop the retreat. So this wounded sergeant, was a sergeant actually, would say, when a shell burst hit and killed him instantly. Very enigmatic character, though. But a true soldier. Irvin would call him just the embodiment of being a Christian soldier. Just an interesting character. Morgan and the McKinlock, meanwhile, were with the 3rd Machine Gun Battalion, and they spent 3 days under severe shell fire, small arms fire, machine gun fire. It was a hellish experience that McKinlock came out and said it was great, and Morgan came out and said, I just can't believe this is horrible. But I'll get back to it in a minute. Newhall finally, after 40 hours, which puts it in early in the morning of the 30th of May, where he had gone in at 6:30 in the morning on May 28th, finally managed to prop himself up and get a hold on the parapet of a small trench he had found and try to get back to his lines. But he was worried that he was going to be shot by his old men in the middle of the night. It's 2 a.m. in the morning. I just described that a little bit and how he finds out about what's been going on. Moving painfully, he now worried that his own men might shoot him, thinking he was a German. When I began to make my way through our wire, fortunately not very thick, I was challenged from our trench, he wrote. They were suspicious of me for fear it was some German ruse. An American voice yelled, "Who goes there?" "Friend, a wounded American," Newhall replied. "Advance to be recognized. Who are you?" "Lieutenant Newhall, L Company." At that point, men jumped out and helped me out of the trench. His first question was whether the regiment had taken Cantini. Yes, he was told. What about Haydock? He was killed. The 3 simple words sent Newhall reeling. I went to pieces and cried out, probably somewhat hysterically, he would write. I remember a voice saying, Captain Mosher was killed too. Another doughboy's voice, very angry and stern, immediately followed, don't tell him. Captain Mosher was the captain of Company K, sort of a sister company, Company L, and they'd become quite good friends over the winter and spring. And Saint Amand, Sur Ornain, which is a small village that they were billeted in. Back to Morgan, he was appalled by the experience at Cantini. He'd gone, remember he had he just longed to ram his bayonet through the throat of a Boche and his big talk. And he has kept that up. He developed what he would call the science of the machine gun. He just loved it. He felt like he was like, with it. He was on the cusp of it. Machine guns were where it's at. It's modern warfare. I'm young. I'm there. But then he grows over time to be appalled by the machine gun, by him just sitting there and, as he says, scientifically shooting 250 bullets a minute and just mowing people down as they're coming towards you. So even before Cantini, he starts to really second guess what he's doing there, what the war is all about, how life is so cheap. And then after the 3 days of Cantini, where he actually was told he could leave or ordered out a few hours before the rest of his platoon was for relief, because he kind of, as he said, went to pieces. He cracked up under the stress, as did Charles Walter Ewell, the captain of his company. There's a little bit description of that. With Major Chester Davis, McKinlock, and Captain Charles Ewell, Morgan just lay in one spot for hours wondering where the next shell would fall. It literally drives you mad. You feel like tearing things to pieces and yelling. The shells throw dirt all over you, and one of our men was killed by concussion alone. I can't say enough for the infantry. They held that line hour after hour. It is unbelievable what they stood, and their spirit was beyond all words. His love for the new science of war was replaced by horror at its flesh and blood realities. One man with an arm torn off wanted to go back to the line, and the first aid men finally had to call for volunteers to go up to the front line to dress the wounded who refused to go to the rear. I know of one case, and there are probably more, or a man drank his own urine. That is unbelievable, but so is it all. This whole damn business is unbelievable. So you can see he's kind of really changing. And that's what I loved about, attracted me. First of all, the Newhall-Haydock story, which is almost a love story. Actually, his son Daniel worried that people are going to think they were gay. I mean, I had to assure him no, but it's like, because they were sharing, a bunk in the small cottage that they were renting, but like men will share a blanket in a shell hole, kind of thing. But it was a very tight, and especially under the terms of, you don't know if the one guy's going to get bumped off the next minute or not, and that makes things more intense. That's the kind of thing that you don't see a lot I think in accounts of war, but certainly not from World War I, and that's what attracted me to that story. And then with Morgan, it was just this dissolution. He goes from being this young, gung-ho, can-do guy to, in the space of 9 months, just kind of dissolving, just losing his mind, recognizing that he has shell shock. Because as he put it, he was manning the lines or manning his machine gun like at Seychelles for days on end, weeks on end. We're just sitting there with the artillery shells are falling, whereas in the infantry, companies were being rotated in a week or 10 days at a time. He was getting no break, and he cracked. There's no question about it. He went into Soissons in the days after Cantigny for several weeks. He couldn't even go back to the line. He said, I tried. I just can't. Every time he heard a car backfire, he leapt out of his skin. Finally went back, was part of the advance by the 1st Division on the morning of July 18th at Soissons, and was manhandling a machine gun cart. These were very heavy carts that held machine gun ammo, hard to maneuver, when it ran over his foot on the trail there, somewhere in the rain. And whether it was intentionally ran over his foot or not, he didn't say, but he tried to go on, but said he had to finally take his shoe off, and a regimental surgeon came by and told him to go to the rear. And I think he kind of skipped back there because he was so happy to be out of it. He just didn't have it anymore. He didn't believe in the cause. He didn't believe in the war. I think he wrote several times about seeing at Cantigny a doughboy staving in the head of a German who was way dead already. He's dead already. Kept doing it. I think it's just the realization that man had not evolved to a point where maybe he thought man had evolved to, got to him. He was a sensitive soul to begin with. So he went back over the field of dead and dying at Soissons that morning, and his descriptions of that are horrible, heart-wrenching. Men, laying there with no legs, reaching out for him, calling for water, these kind of things. And then he finds out later that most of his platoon was killed at Soissons over the next 4 days. And then just keeps a running count in his head. He's back. Gets medical attention, and then he's on leave in Paris. And he writes about all these people he knew from Harvard or wherever who are dead now, by name. It's just like so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so. And he goes before a board to decide whether he's going to go back to active duty. And the officer asks him, do you want to go back? And all he says was, I'm asking everlasting forgiveness for the lie I told him. Meaning he told him yes, but they didn't send him back. So, and that was pretty much it. That was his war. He wound up finagling a job with the Treaty Commission, traveling around Austria and places like this, and went back to America, married Christiana Councilman, a very unhappy marriage, and he died before he was 40 years old of tuberculosis that he had probably picked up in the trenches. Anyway, that's Morgan. McKinlock, who had such a good time at Cantigny in the meantime, he had not been under fire, by the way, for much of the war. He dutifully he'd been appointed now to this 2nd Brigade staff under General Beaumont Buck. And on July 21st, elements of the 28th, 16th, 18th regiments took the key town of Berzy-le-Sec, and that finished the battle pretty much, finished that campaign, and the Germans were on their heels. And Buck asked McKinlock, as a staff officer, to go and reconnoiter and find out exactly where the front line was below Berzy-le-Sec. And he started down the road, down Plazy Ravine, and was joined by a couple of French liaison officers, and they were walking along, and a shot rang out, and McKinlock dropped dead. He was just dead shot. What was interesting to me and drew me to his story as one of the 5 lieutenants, though, is his body disappeared right after that. And there became this concerted campaign on the part of his wealthy and influential mother to find out what had happened to him, like it would anybody. She actually sent an emissary, Daniel Woodhead, who had been his football coach at one of the boarding schools and was now working for the company business, or the family business, to go to France and look for it. And he searched all over Berzy-le-Sec. He found a couple graves he thought were possible. The army refused to disinter him. Finally, they did one, found out it was a German soldier buried there. From there, the story gets a little weird. Mary McKinlock is asked to go to France and work for the Red Cross, and she jumps at it, thinking that maybe she can go find her boy now, who has also been rumored as possibly, in a German prisoner camp, because nobody's been able to see him. So she goes over there, hooks up with Woodhead near Berzy-le-Sec, and the legend has it walked straight to his grave, which had been mismarked as McKinlow instead of McKinlock, and then a helmet on there. How that got missed, I don't know. This is the story as presented. And McKinlock would have more infamy as a dead man than he would as a live man when Muriel McCormick, very wealthy, granddaughter of Rockefeller and McCormick, decided that under the influence of her mother, who had been taken by this whole spiritual wave that was sweeping the United States with the Tutankhamun discovery in, I think, 1922, and everybody got into their past lives and all this stuff. And Muriel decided that she had been spiritually betrothed to the young hero, Alexander McKinlock, and kind of reached out to his mother, Marion, and they became fast friends, like best friends for the rest of their lives. But it was funny because Muriel would tell all suitors, "Sorry, I'm married." She had a black wedding ring she wore that was his, until she grew tired of this story. And that was the end of it, and she married a wealthy gentleman farmer, Elisha Hubbard. And she married him at the McKinlock's Maine estate. Anyway, winding down a little bit, what's interesting, too, about Newhall is he became a history professor at Williams College in Williamstown, Massachusetts. Had kids, married. He actually married a woman with the Smith College relief unit who he had met in France. And that's described in the book, too. With Haydock, they met these 2 women, took him out to dinner, and then a love relationship developed after she tended to him in the hospital. It's kind of touching. So they got married, had kids, lived his life. And it's interesting, it was towards the end of his life, that he returned to the story of George Haydock, who was obviously, he writes that he was always at the forefront of his mind, that there was an unrequited kind of love that he had, that he called it the most perfect friendship he'd ever had. But then he began to wonder, would we have had, would that friendship had endured had George lived? Or would we just sort of have drifted off and gone into our own lives? Probably, who knows? He became kind of philosophical. Ever the philosopher, he became very philosophical about that. But it's very touching because you can just tell how much that happy time, even in the midst of what was not a happy time, was a war, stuck with him. And I think was the most profound relationship he ever had, even though it was only 4 or 5 months long. Anyway, but I went to go through all of Newhall's papers in 2010. I went right to the Haydock file. It's got this thick. It's correspondence with George's parents, his sister, back and forth. It's fascinating because George's parents immediately reached out to Richard Newhall as the last vestige of their son, and he knew what George had gone through. They invited him back to their house for Christmas in 1918. He stayed in the East because of his wounds. Went there and stayed in George's room. I mean, it's just amazing stuff you just don't see, and really struck me, still strikes me as just sad, poignant. I don't know what you want to call it. But he's very affected by George. Anyway, he returned to the subject of George, and I'll just end it, but he was fond of, Newhall was fond of jotting down his dreams, and I found this in the Haydock file, and it's dated August 7th, 1967, Williamstown, Massachusetts. Last night, I dreamed of George Haydock. This has never happened before. With his picture before me for many years, my memories of him are always clear, and my mind treasures these as the expression and realization of a perfect friendship, which is best described with the second movement of Beethoven's piano solo, Pathetique. Yet in all of 49 years, I have not dreamt of George, nor is there anything reason to suggest an explanation. My memory of the dream is somewhat vague, but we seemed to be going somewhere together until we came to a place where I turned aside and he went on, and I kissed him on the cheek. Any questions? Yes, sir.
How many of the five survived the war?
Two. Yeah, Newhall and Morgan. And Newhall died in 1973. He was about 85 when he died.
Do they have any siblings that may have had other offspring?
Oh, yeah. How do you mean?
Well, I mean, are any of the descendants still, are for either one of them?
Oh, yeah. I actually, I talked to two of the Morgan's granddaughters, and I got photos from Hillary. And Newhall, actually, they had a daughter, and she had preeclampsia at the time of the birth, Newhall's wife, and almost died. And so then they adopted two boys, and Daniel was still alive. I dedicated the book to Daniel. He helped me with it, and his reminiscences about his father. He said his father, sorry, I should be over here. His father said whenever they go to D.C., they had to go to the First Division Monument and honor George. That was a requirement in the family. And yeah, it's touching. Newhall every year sent a donation, I think to the Red Cross or something, in George's name until he died. He sent roses to the family, to Haydock's mother, and then sister till he died. Because Louisa outlived him by 18 years or something. But yeah, I mean, it's very touching. It was sort of like it just went on, you know. And it's just I've never seen anything like it to that degree. But I mean, I think it's more common than people think, you know, army buddies, whatever you want to call it, you know. But you just don't see it written about with such honesty. Is all I'm saying. You know.
Any other questions?
Yes, sir.
Thanks, J.D. Did the tone of the letters of all five lieutenants change as they got into contact, or did they exhibit their own?
As it went along.
Yeah.
I would say Haydock's tone changes. He becomes a little, like I said, a little more cynical, a little more actually self-assured, because he goes in and he's not self-assured at all. I mean, he's like so unself-assured, whatever is a better word for that. Newhall remains Newhall throughout, and Morgan totally changes. Redwood was Redwood to the end, funny, you know, just kind of lighthearted about everything, and the same with McKinlock, yeah. Except McKinlock did write, he was hoping to get a job with the infantry company. I think he was, you know, realizing that, you know, he wasn't really doing that much for the war effort. He was doing his staff job, but I think he wanted to get more involved and get out of that, so. Yes?
In your research, when did you feel the closest to your subjects? Was there like a moment where you were just like, you felt like you were deeply involved in these guys' lives?
I think it's that last dream thing. When I saw that, you know, I was just like, number one, I said, okay, there's the end of the book right there. You know what I mean? And I just, I didn't know until that point just how deep the Newhall Haydock thing went, you know. But I also felt for Morgan very much to read the passages where he's just trying to explain to his girlfriend, who wants him to be this big hero, macho man, you know, why he can't go up to the front anymore. And she, actually, it's not in the book, but she was writing letters saying, you're not telling your men this stuff, are you? You know what I mean? Like, you know, you shouldn't do that kind of thing. She's becoming worried about him big time. I kept them mostly to him, just so it's his story. But yeah, those two elements are the most human parts, I think. Yes, sir.
Did any of the survivors, children, were they in the military? Did they say?
Yeah, actually, Newhall's, both of his sons were in the military. And I know Roger, the older one, was with the 10th Mountain Division. in Italy. Does that sound right? And went through some very, very tough times there, and came home. Daniel says very different than he had gone over. So had been very affected for the rest of his life. Yeah, and it was a requirement almost on Newhall's part. Newhall felt very, very deeply about public service and military service. Yes.
Follow up on that, were you able to connect any of their experiences through discussions with them with what you found in the journals?
I talked to Daniel a lot. Roger's dead. But no, Daniel, I think, he was served in Germany or something post-war. Yeah, or he didn't see combat or anything like that. So it wasn't really, nothing really commonality there, Yes?
I didn't get the sense that these Harvard fellows had much military skills training in infantry tactics.
No, I don't think, but yeah, I don't know if anybody did in the first part of the war, though. I'm doing a piece for Edward Langell. I'm doing a piece on, he's doing a companion to the Meuse-Argonne book. It'd be kind of interesting. So one of the chapters is Medal of Honor winners. And, at Soissons, there was a lot of talk about how these American soldiers just rushed straight into the machine guns. But what I'm finding with these stories about some of these Medal of Honor winners, there seem to be more tactics involved at the end of the war in the fall. Maybe I might be wrong, but pinning the front and then working the edges, these kind of things. But no, I don't think they did teach them a lot about that. I think it was a lot. They had to learn a lot. How do you teach someone to lead? Element of the book is, the struggles that George Haydock especially had, as he put it, dealing with some tough Texas hayseed who's been a regular for 5 years, who knows drill inside and out, and George is fumbling, looking at the book, going, "What do I do?" And yet he's supposed to be the leader. Yes, there's no way to teach that. You just have to do it. But he did have some older, one guy, a non-com named Charles Stromberg, took him under his wing before Newhall showed up, and showed him how to do certain regular routine drills or whatever with his platoon. Yes, sir.
Yeah, good. As Harvard men, I presume these guys are both are all articulate as well as well-educated in the big picture. As you read their material, do you have any sense, did they convey any sense of the meaning of World War I, both in terms of the history of the world and in terms of America's role in the developing history of the world?
When you say they, who do you mean?
Yeah.
These men?
Yes.
Yeah, I didn't touch on that really. I have a very, very evolved sense, especially as you would imagine Newhall, who's a history professor. I mean, he goes in talking about his motivations are really, is like one world government without borders, and that way we're not going to have any wars. Totally anti-nationalist. So he has a real world view like that. And I would say Morgan, to some degree, does too. He would write about the coming great reorganization after the war, almost like a Russian Revolution kind of thing. Because the war was, so traumatic, and people were thinking, how do we stop this? Well, you get rid of nation states. I don't know. You know what I mean? It's utopian, I suppose. I think, But that was their impetus. Those two specifically. The other three. Redwood's very intelligent. Oh, obviously very intelligent. It didn't come up in their material that I could say one way or the other why. I just think Redwood was he would want to enlist in 1914, along with a number of Harvard people who did. His mother dissuaded him from it. He wanted to go fight with the British, the Canadians, so.
Of these 5 men, of those who went to the preparedness camps, did they actually feel prepared, or were they surprised by what confronted them once they got themselves overseas?
I think they were totally unprepared. Yeah, I don't think it scratched the surface. They were in these camps. They were doing a few exercises. Newhall writes about one where he had this great success, where at the end of it he rushed the enemy, kind of thing. But a lot of it was drilling. It was digging ditches. I think it was kind of trying to harden them up in a way, if nothing else, like the first camp had been called the Tired Businessman Camp. I don't think they'd learned a lot about tactics or military philosophy or that kind of thing. So when they got over to France, I think they really started learning a few things from the Brits who had been in the war. Some practical things, how to throw a grenade, how to dig the return in your trench and these kind of things, yeah. Yeah. Sorry? In the camps, they did. But like I say, Pershing wanted to keep the American Army totally separate.
And then on that note, did they have any, because by 1917, most of the combatants were ready to, call a truce, call it off. They had enough. Did any of that precipitate or push into their psyche?
Well, I know there were mutinies on the French side, right? When you say they wanted to give it up. I can't say that by 17, Germany was ready to give it up because they pulled back their front lines and straightened out their front lines in anticipation of a huge assault once Russia was out of the war to stop, to end the war before all these Americans could get over here. So I don't think Germany was ready to throw in the towel, and I don't think the Brits were either. The Brits were like, they were pretty steadfast. So there is none, to answer the question, no, I didn't get anything like that. What I got from these guys, these Americans getting over there is, let's get this war over with and get home. I'm very practical Americans. Same thing in World War II, I think, Let's just show these guys how to fight and get out of here, So.
You mentioned a history professor. Do you know the 5 majors and if they graduated from Harvard?
They all graduated. Well, Newhall got his PhD in history like in June of 17 when he was at Plattsburgh, or in the training camp, yeah. I think Haydock was English, and I don't know. They didn't really count majors that much back then, I don't think. It was just kind of like you matriculated and whatever, but no, I don't know. Yeah, sorry. I'm gonna go check though. That's it. I appreciate you all coming. I really appreciate you letting me talk about my book. Thank you. Oh, here, I'll get out of here. Oh, stay here. Oh, great, thanks. One second. Oh, okay.
Thank you all for coming. We appreciate that, and we may not have much around here, but we offer a small token of our gratitude to our speaker here. This is his second time here, so we give him a different one.
My wife loves anything free.
Thank you all for coming. As you know, the Cantini Legion Post is always collecting for the Midwest Shelter for Homeless Veterans. If you have any change, please, see the gentleman over there with the mailbox. Also, next month on the 15th is we're going to have Rick Atkinson. Rick Atkinson is a Pulitzer Prize winning author. He has written a trilogy called the Liberation Trilogy about World War II. His final book is coming out May 14th, really the day before we are having him here. So he will be here on the 15th of May and talking about his last book, The Guns at Last Light. So please join us for that. I think this is going to be a phenomenal event, and thank you for coming tonight. There's one in June.